Princess Camila had been planning her escape for exactly 7 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. She knew this because she had marked each passing day on a small piece of parchment hidden beneath her mattress, counting down to the moment when she could finally break free from the suffocating walls of Castle Eldoria. Tonight was the night she had circled in red ink, the night when the moon would be dark enough to hide her movements and the guard rotations would create a precious 15-minute window of opportunity. The princess stood before her ornate mirror, staring at the reflection of a young woman who had never truly belonged to herself. At 23, Camila possessed the kind of beauty that poets wrote about: cascading auburn hair that caught light like captured fire, emerald eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets, and porcelain skin that had never known the touch of honest work. But beneath that carefully maintained exterior lived a spirit that yearned for something far beyond the gilded cage of royalty. Her fingers trembled slightly as she removed the heavy diamond tiara that had been placed on her head since childhood. The weight of it had always felt like a burden rather than a privilege, and tonight she set it down on her dressing table with the finality of someone saying goodbye forever. She had already changed into the simplest dress she owned, a plain brown traveling gown that her lady-in-waiting had procured from the village below. It felt strange against her skin, rough and honest in a way that her silk gowns never had. The castle around her slept in the deep silence that only came in the hours before dawn. Camila had studied the patterns of her home for months, learning when each servant retired, when the guards changed their posts, and when the corridors would be empty enough for her to move unseen. She had memorized every creaking floorboard, every door that groaned on its hinges, every shadow that could provide cover. In her small leather bag, she had packed only the most essential items. A few pieces of jewelry that she could sell for passage to distant lands, a miniature portrait of her mother who had died when Camila was only 7, some basic medicines, and a letter she had written to her father explaining her decision. The letter had taken her weeks to compose, each word carefully chosen to convey both her love for him and her desperate need for freedom. Her father, King Marcus, was not a cruel man, but he was a traditional one. He had already arranged her marriage to Prince Aldric of the neighboring kingdom of Valthorn, a political alliance that would strengthen both realms but would seal Camila's fate as nothing more than a beautiful ornament in another man's court. Prince Aldric was handsome enough and seemed kind during their formal meetings, but Camila felt nothing when she looked at him except a growing sense of panic at the thought of spending her life as his wife. She had tried to speak with her father about her feelings, but King Marcus viewed marriage as a duty rather than a choice. He reminded her constantly that royal blood came with responsibilities, that her personal desires were secondary to the needs of the kingdom. He spoke of duty and honor and the greater good, but Camila could only hear the sound of prison doors slamming shut. The escape plan itself was elegantly simple. Camila had discovered that twice a week, a merchant caravan left the kingdom at dawn, carrying goods to the coastal cities where ships departed for foreign lands. The caravan master, a weathered man named Henrik, owed a debt to one of the castle's kitchen maids. Through careful manipulation of that connection, Camila had arranged for Henrik to unknowingly provide her passage out of Eldoria. She would slip out of the castle, make her way to the caravan's departure point, and hide among the cargo until they were safely beyond the kingdom's borders. As the castle clock chimed 3 times, Camila took one final look around her bedroom. This room had been her entire world for most of her life, filled with beautiful things that had never brought her joy. The silk curtains imported from distant kingdoms, the paintings of long-dead relatives who had all fulfilled their royal duties without question, the shelves lined with books about proper deportment and the history of royal bloodlines. None of it had ever felt real to her, and tonight she was finally going to discover what reality felt like. She opened her door slowly, listening for any sound in the corridor beyond. The castle's night sounds were familiar to her, the distant murmur of guards talking at their posts, the occasional creak of old wood settling, the whisper of wind through the stone passages. Everything seemed normal, exactly as she had observed it during her months of careful planning. Camila stepped into the hallway, her soft leather shoes making no sound on the worn carpet that ran down the center of the corridor. She had practiced this walk dozens of times, always under the pretense of seeking a glass of water or visiting the castle's library. Every step was calculated, every turn planned to avoid the areas where guards might notice her movement. The first part of her journey took her down 2 flights of stairs to the main level of the castle. Here, the corridors were wider and more formal, lined with portraits of her ancestors who gazed down at her with painted eyes that seemed to judge her treachery. She forced herself not to look at them, focusing instead on the path ahead and the promise of freedom that lay beyond the castle walls. As she moved through the familiar passages, Camila found herself thinking about her mother, Queen Isabella, who had died in childbirth when attempting to give the kingdom a male heir. Isabella had been married to King Marcus in an arrangement similar to the one now planned for Camila, but she had seemed genuinely happy in her role as queen. Camila wondered if her mother had ever dreamed of escape, or if she had been content to live within the boundaries set by her royal birth. The library was her first major checkpoint, a vast room filled with thousands of books that had been Camila's refuge during her lonely childhood. She had spent countless hours here, reading about distant lands and different ways of life, fueling the dreams that had eventually grown into her escape plan. Tonight, the library felt different, charged with the energy of her secret mission and the knowledge that she might never see it again. From the library, she needed to reach the old servants' quarters in the eastern wing of the castle. This section was largely abandoned now, used mainly for storage since the staff had been consolidated in more modern accommodations. It was also where she could access an ancient service tunnel that connected to the castle's wine cellars. The tunnel had been built centuries ago to allow servants to move supplies without disturbing the royal family, and it had been forgotten by everyone except Camila, who had discovered it during her childhood explorations. The walk to the eastern wing required her to cross the castle's main hall, a magnificent space with a vaulted ceiling and enormous stained glass windows that depicted the history of the royal family. During the day, sunlight streaming through the colored glass created beautiful patterns on the marble floor, but at night the hall was filled with deep shadows that provided perfect cover for her passage. Camila paused at the edge of the main hall, listening carefully for any sign that the guards were making their rounds early. She could hear nothing except her own heartbeat, which seemed loud enough to wake the entire castle. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the vast space and began to cross it as quickly as she could while still moving silently. Halfway across the hall, she heard footsteps echoing from somewhere in the castle above her. Camila froze, pressing herself against one of the massive stone pillars that supported the ceiling. The footsteps seemed to be coming from the direction of her father's chambers, and, for a terrifying moment, she wondered if someone had already discovered her absence. But the sounds faded into the distance, and she realized it was probably just a guard making a routine patrol. The eastern wing felt cold and unwelcoming after the grandeur of the main castle. Here, the corridors were narrower and the decorations sparse. Dust motes danced in the faint light that filtered through small windows, and the air smelled of disuse and forgotten memories. Camila found the entrance to the servants' quarters easily, having visited this location several times during her planning phase. The service tunnel was exactly as she remembered it, a narrow passage carved into the stone foundations of the castle, just tall enough for her to walk upright if she kept her head slightly bowed. The walls were rough and damp, and spider webs caught at her hair as she made her way through the darkness. She had brought a small lantern with her, but she didn't dare light it until she was sure she was completely hidden from any potential observers. The tunnel seemed longer than she remembered, stretching ahead into blackness that her eyes couldn't penetrate. Every sound seemed amplified in the confined space, the rustle of her dress against the stone walls, her careful breathing, the soft pad of her footsteps on the uneven floor. She began to worry that she had taken a wrong turn somewhere, that she would emerge in the wrong location and ruin her carefully planned escape. But finally, she saw a faint rectangle of gray light ahead of her, marking the exit that led to the wine cellars. The relief she felt was overwhelming, and she had to fight the urge to run toward the light. Instead, she maintained her careful pace, knowing that hasty movement now could still destroy everything she had worked for. The wine cellars were vast underground chambers filled with wooden barrels and stone alcoves where bottles of the kingdom's finest vintages aged in darkness. The air here was thick with the scent of fermenting grapes and old wood, a rich aroma that reminded Camila of harvest festivals and celebrations she would no longer be part of. She navigated between the barrels carefully, using her memory of the layout to find the external door that led to the castle's lower courtyard. This door was her greatest concern because it was secured with a heavy iron lock. However, during her months of planning, she had carefully observed the head butler's daily routines and had learned where he kept the spare keys. 3 weeks ago, she had managed to create a wax impression of the correct key, and yesterday she had used that impression to have a duplicate made by a blacksmith in the village who believed she needed it for a surprise birthday party for her father. Her hands shook as she inserted the key into the lock, terrified that it wouldn't work or that someone would hear the mechanism turning. But the key fit perfectly and the lock opened with only the softest click. Camila pushed the heavy door open just wide enough to slip through, and suddenly, she was outside the castle for the first time in her life without an escort. The lower courtyard was a utilitarian space where deliveries were made and waste was removed. It was surrounded by high walls, but it was still technically outside the castle proper, and Camila felt a surge of excitement at this first taste of freedom. The night air was cool against her face, carrying scents of the surrounding forest and the distant village that she had only ever observed from her tower window. From here, she needed to reach the outer wall of the castle complex, where a small gate led to the path that would take her to the caravan's meeting point. This gate was used primarily by hunting parties and was guarded, but Camila had timed her escape to coincide with a shift change that would give her a few minutes when the gate would be unobserved. She crept along the base of the castle wall, staying in the shadows and moving as quietly as possible. The grass was wet with dew, and she could feel the moisture seeping through her thin shoes. Her heart was racing with a mixture of fear and exhilaration as she realized that she was actually doing it. She was actually escaping from everything that had defined her entire existence. The outer gate appeared ahead of her, a simple wooden door set into the massive stone wall that surrounded the castle complex. As she had hoped, no guard was visible at the small guardhouse beside it. Camila approached the gate carefully, listening for any sound that might indicate someone was nearby. All she could hear was the distant call of a night bird and the whisper of wind through the trees beyond the wall. The gate was secured with a simple latch rather than a lock, reflecting its low security status as a hunting entrance. Camila lifted the latch slowly, wincing at the small sound it made. The gate opened outward, revealing a narrow path that led down through the forest toward the village below. Beyond the gate lay a world of infinite possibilities, a future where she could choose her own destiny. As she stepped through the gate and onto the forest path, Princess Camila felt tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. She was no longer within the boundaries of Castle Eldoria. For the first time in her 23 years of life, she was truly free. The forest path wound its way down the hillside like a serpent, disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow all light. Camila had never walked through a forest alone, and every sound made her heart skip with either terror or wonder. The crunch of fallen leaves beneath her feet, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, the mysterious creaks and groans of ancient trees swaying in the night breeze. It was all foreign and magical to someone who had spent her entire life within stone walls. She moved carefully, using the walking stick she had thoughtfully included in her preparations. The path was uneven and treacherous in the darkness, with exposed roots and loose stones that could easily trip an unwary traveler. Several times she stumbled, catching herself just before falling and sending her heart racing with the fear that she might injure herself and ruin her escape before it had truly begun. The trees around her were massive oaks and elms that had stood for centuries, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the faint starlight struggled to penetrate to the forest floor. In the distance, she could hear the sound of running water, probably the stream that she knew flowed from the mountains down through the village. That stream would be her guide, leading her to the road where Henrik's caravan would be preparing for departure. As she walked, Camila found herself thinking about what lay ahead. She had gold and jewelry worth enough to buy passage to the distant continent of Ethermore, where she had heard that women could own property and choose their own paths in life. The stories told of cities where merchants and scholars worked alongside each other regardless of their birth, where talent and determination mattered more than bloodlines. It sounded like a dream, but it was a dream she was finally pursuing. The path began to level out as she descended toward the valley where the village lay. Through gaps in the trees, she could see faint lights in the distance, probably lanterns in the windows of early rising bakers and farmers preparing for the day ahead. The sight of those lights filled her with both hope and terror. Soon she would be among common people, trying to blend in despite her complete lack of experience in the real world. She had practiced speaking like a commoner during her preparations, listening to the castle servants and trying to mimic their accents and mannerisms. She had also studied maps and trade routes, learning about the world beyond Eldoria's borders. But she knew that book learning was very different from actual experience, and she worried that her privileged upbringing would be obvious to anyone who looked at her closely. The sound of the stream grew louder as she approached the bottom of the hill. Soon she could see the water itself, a dark ribbon reflecting the faint light of the stars. She knelt beside it to drink, cupping the cold water in her hands and marveling at how different it tasted from the filtered water served in golden chalices at the castle. This water tasted of earth and stone and life, wild and free in a way that perfectly matched her mood. Following the stream, Camila made her way toward the village of Millbrook, which served the castle and provided most of its supplies. She had visited Millbrook a few times during formal occasions, always in an elaborate carriage surrounded by guards and courtiers. But she had never seen it like this, in the quiet hours before dawn when it belonged only to itself rather than performing for royal visitors. The village was small but prosperous, with well-maintained houses and shops that reflected the steady income provided by serving the castle. The main road was paved with cobblestones, and even in the darkness she could see that the buildings were sturdy and well cared for. Most of the windows were dark, but smoke rose from several chimneys where early risers were already beginning their daily routines. Camila made her way carefully through the sleeping village, staying in the shadows and avoiding the main street where she might be seen. She had memorized the layout during her previous visits, and she knew that Henrik's caravan would be gathering at the old market square on the far side of town. The square was used for weekly markets during the day, but in the early morning it served as a staging area for merchant caravans preparing to depart. As she reached the edge of the market square, Camila could see activity in the pre-dawn darkness. Lanterns moved like fireflies as men loaded wagons and prepared horses for the journey ahead. She could hear the low murmur of voices and the creak of leather harnesses being adjusted. The familiar sounds of purposeful work filled her with excitement as she realized that her plan was actually working. She found a hiding place behind a stack of empty barrels and settled in to wait for the right moment to approach the caravan. According to her careful planning, she needed to wait until the loading was nearly complete and the men were focused on final preparations. Then, she would slip into one of the supply wagons and conceal herself among the goods until they were safely away from the village. While she waited, Camila watched the organized chaos of caravan preparation with fascination. She had never seen common people work before, at least not up close. The men moved with practiced efficiency, each one knowing exactly what needed to be done without requiring detailed instructions. They joked with each other as they worked, their easy camaraderie so different from the formal interactions she was used to at court. Henrik himself was easy to identify, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and hands that showed the calluses of honest labor. He moved among his workers with the confidence of someone who had been leading caravans for decades, checking cargo and giving occasional directions. Camila studied him carefully, trying to gauge whether he seemed like someone who might be sympathetic to a desperate young woman seeking passage to freedom. As she watched, a terrible thought occurred to her. What if Henrik recognized her despite her disguise? She had tried to alter her appearance by braiding her hair differently and avoiding the cosmetics that normally enhanced her features. But she knew that her face was familiar to many people in the kingdom. If Henrik identified her as the princess, he would almost certainly try to return her to the castle, either out of loyalty or fear of the king's wrath. The loading process continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Camila's legs began to cramp from crouching behind the barrels, and she started to worry that dawn would arrive before she could make her move. She had timed her escape to take advantage of the darkness. But if the sun rose while she was still trying to join the caravan, her chances of success would diminish dramatically. Finally, the activity began to wind down as the last of the cargo was secured and the horses were hitched to their wagons. Camila could see Henrik talking with what appeared to be his second-in-command, probably discussing the route and schedule for the day ahead. This was her moment. She needed to act before the caravan departed. But after the men had finished their preparations and were less likely to notice an additional passenger, she crept forward from her hiding place, moving as quietly as possible toward the wagon that she had identified as her target. It was loaded with barrels of grain and had enough space for her to conceal herself if she was careful. The wagon was positioned at the rear of the caravan, which would make it easier for her to approach without being seen by the majority of the workers. Just as she reached the wagon and was preparing to climb aboard, she heard Henrik's voice calling out to his men. "Time to move out. We want to reach Thornfield by midday, so let's get these wagons rolling." The sudden activity as the caravan prepared to depart made Camila's heart race with panic. She had to get into the wagon now before it started moving, and while everyone was focused on their departure preparations, she grabbed the edge of the wagon bed and pulled herself up, trying to move as quietly as possible despite the urgency of the situation. The grain barrels provided good cover, and she managed to wedge herself into a space between them where she would be hidden from casual observation. The rough wood of the wagon bed was uncomfortable against her back, and the smell of grain dust made her want to sneeze. But she had made it. She was actually hiding in a merchant caravan that would carry her away from everything she had ever known. The wagon lurched as it began to move, and Camila felt a thrill of terror and excitement run through her entire body. The wooden wheels rumbled over the cobblestones of the market square, creating a steady rhythm that would mask any small sounds she might make. Through gaps in the cargo, she could see the familiar buildings of Millbrook passing by in the gray pre-dawn light. As the caravan left the village and began traveling along the main road that led away from Castle Eldoria, Camila allowed herself to feel the first real hope she had experienced in months. Every turn of the wagon wheels carried her further from her predetermined fate and closer to the freedom she had dreamed about for so long. The motion of the wagon was soothing after the tension of her escape, and she found herself relaxing for the first time since she had left her bedroom. But her moment of peace was interrupted by voices from the front of the caravan. She could hear Henrik talking with someone, though she couldn't make out the words over the sound of the wagon wheels and horse hooves. Then, she heard something that made her blood freeze in her veins. The sound of galloping horses approaching from behind the caravan, moving much faster than normal travel pace. Through a gap in the cargo, she could see riders approaching in the growing daylight. They wore the distinctive blue and silver of the Royal Guard, and even from a distance she could recognize the lead rider. It was Captain Alderon, the head of her father's personal guard and one of the most skilled trackers in the kingdom. Somehow, her absence had been discovered much sooner than she had anticipated, and now the very nightmare she had tried to avoid was bearing down on her hiding place. The riders reached the caravan quickly, and Camila heard Henrik's voice raised in surprise as Captain Alderon questioned him about unauthorized passengers. She pressed herself as far down into her hiding place as possible, praying that the grain barrels would conceal her from searching eyes. Her heart was beating so loudly that she was sure everyone within a mile could hear it. "By order of King Marcus, we are searching all departing caravans for a missing person," Captain Alderon announced in his authoritative voice. "Stand aside and allow my men to inspect your cargo." Camila could hear the sound of boots hitting the ground as the guards dismounted and began to approach the wagons. Henrik's voice carried clearly in the morning air as he protested the search. "Captain, I assure you that my caravan carries only legitimate trade goods. We have no passengers except my own men, and I can account for every one of them." But his protests were ignored as the guards began systematically searching each wagon in the caravan. Camila could hear them getting closer, opening cargo containers and moving aside goods as they looked for any sign of a hidden passenger. She knew that it was only a matter of minutes before they reached her wagon, and when they did, her escape attempt would be over before it had truly begun. All of her careful planning, all of her dreams of freedom, would be destroyed by a search that she had never anticipated. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder as the guards worked their way toward the rear of the caravan. Camila closed her eyes and tried to make herself as small as possible, knowing that her fate now rested entirely in the hands of chance. As the footsteps stopped beside her wagon, Princess Camila held her breath and prepared to discover whether her desperate bid for freedom would end in success or in the most public failure of her young life. Captain Alderon's boots scraped against the cobblestones as he approached the grain wagon where Princess Camila lay hidden. She could hear his measured breathing and the soft jingle of his chain mail as he moved closer to her hiding spot. Through the narrow gaps between the barrels, she caught glimpses of his weathered face, etched with the kind of determination that had made him legendary throughout the kingdom for his unwavering loyalty to the crown. "This one's loaded with grain barrels," she heard one of the younger guards say as he climbed onto the wagon bed. The wood creaked ominously under his weight, and Camila felt the entire wagon shift slightly. Her heart was beating so violently that she was certain the rhythm would give her away, like drums announcing her presence to anyone who cared to listen. Captain Alderon's voice was calm but commanding as he directed the search. "Move each barrel carefully. Check underneath and behind them. The princess is clever and resourceful, and she would choose a hiding place that provides good concealment." The way he spoke about her made Camila realize that he knew her better than she had thought. He had been watching her, studying her patterns and habits, probably anticipating that she might attempt something exactly like this. The young guard began shifting the grain barrels one by one, and with each movement, Camila's hiding space grew smaller and more precarious. She pressed herself against the wooden side of the wagon, trying to become invisible through sheer force of will. The rough grain sacks scratched against her face, and dust particles made her nose itch terribly, but she didn't dare move or make the slightest sound. "Nothing here, Captain," the guard called out after checking the first section of the wagon. But Camila knew he was working systematically toward her location, and it was only a matter of time before her hiding spot was discovered. She began to consider her options if she was found. Should she try to run? Should she throw herself on Captain Alderon's mercy? Should she attempt to convince him that she had valid reasons for leaving the kingdom? As the search continued, she heard Henrik's voice raised in growing frustration. "Captain, this delay is costing me valuable time. The roads become more dangerous as the day progresses, and I have a schedule to maintain. Surely you can see that my caravan carries nothing more suspicious than grain and trade goods." His protest carried the tone of a man who was accustomed to conducting his business without interference from the authorities. Captain Alderon's response was measured and professional. "Master Henrik, I understand your concerns, but I have my orders directly from King Marcus. The princess is missing from the castle, and we have reason to believe she may be attempting to leave the kingdom. Every departing caravan must be searched thoroughly, regardless of the inconvenience this may cause." The mention of her father sent a pang of guilt through Camila's heart. She could imagine King Marcus discovering her empty bedroom, reading the letter she had left explaining her decision, and feeling the terrible weight of both anger and sorrow. She had not wanted to hurt him, but she had seen no other way to claim the life she needed to live. The thought of his pain made her question her decision for a moment, but then she remembered the suffocating prospect of marriage to Prince Aldrich and knew she had made the only choice she could. The searching guard had now moved most of the barrels in the front section of the wagon and was working his way toward her hiding place with methodical precision. Camila could see his boots through the gaps in the cargo, and she estimated that he would reach her location within the next few minutes. Her mouth was dry with terror, and Her hands were shaking so badly that she had to clasp them together to keep them still. Suddenly, there was a commotion from another part of the caravan. "Captain! Over here!" One of the guards called out urgently. "I found something suspicious in this wagon." The sound of running footsteps filled the air as Captain Alderaan and several other guards rushed toward the source of the excitement. The guard who had been searching Camila's wagon jumped down immediately, abandoning his systematic inspection to join his colleagues in investigating the potential discovery. Camila heard their voices growing distant as they gathered around another wagon, discussing whatever had been found. She couldn't make out their exact words, but the tone suggested they believed they had found something significant. This unexpected reprieve filled Camila with both relief and renewed terror. She was safe for the moment, but she knew that the search would resume as soon as the guards realized that whatever they had found was not what they were looking for. She needed to use this precious time to either find a better hiding place or figure out some other way to avoid detection. Very carefully, she shifted her position to get a better view of what was happening. Through the gaps in the cargo, she could see the guards clustered around a wagon near the middle of the caravan. They seemed to be examining something with great interest, and their animated discussion suggested that they thought they had found evidence of the missing princess. Henrik was standing nearby, his face showing the frustration of a merchant who was watching his carefully planned schedule dissolve into chaos. "That's just a bolt of fine cloth that I'm transporting to the coastal cities," she heard him explain to the guards. "It's wrapped in silk because it's valuable merchandise, not because anyone is hiding inside it." Captain Alderaan's voice carried a note of disappointment as he responded. "Very well. Continue the search. She must be here somewhere." The realization that their discovery was a false alarm seemed to reinforce his determination rather than discourage him. Camila knew that he would not give up until every inch of the caravan had been examined. As the guards began to disperse back to their systematic searching, Camila realized that her temporary reprieve was about to end. The young guard who had been checking her wagon was already walking back in her direction, ready to resume his methodical inspection of the grain barrels. She had perhaps 30 seconds before he would discover her hiding place and her desperate escape attempt would be over. In that moment of crisis, an idea formed in her mind. It was dangerous and required perfect timing, but it might be her only chance to avoid capture. She had noticed that the wagon's tailgate was secured with a simple rope latch, and if she could release it quietly, she might be able to slip out the back of the wagon while the guard was focused on searching the front section. Very carefully, she began to work her way toward the back of the wagon, moving between the grain barrels as quietly as possible. Every movement had to be calculated to avoid making noise or shifting the cargo in a way that would alert the guards to her presence. The rough wood scraped against her dress, and she worried that the fabric might tear and leave evidence of her passage. She reached the tailgate just as she heard the guard climbing back onto the wagon bed. His footsteps were directly above her now, and she could hear him resuming his systematic movement of the grain barrels. Working as quietly as possible, she began to untie the rope that secured the tailgate, her fingers fumbling with the knots in her nervousness. The rope was more complicated than she had expected, tied with the kind of practical knots that merchant caravans used to secure their cargo during long journeys. Her fingers, soft from a lifetime of royal privilege, struggled with the rough hemp fibers. She could hear the guard getting closer with each barrel he moved, and she knew that she had very little time left. Finally, the last knot came loose, and the tailgate swung open silently on well-oiled hinges. Camila found herself looking out at the road behind the caravan, which was moving at a steady walking pace that would make jumping down dangerous but not impossible. She would have to time her escape perfectly to avoid being seen by the guards who were searching other wagons or by Captain Alderaan, who seemed to be everywhere at once. She waited for a moment when the guards' attention seemed focused elsewhere, then slipped over the tailgate and dropped silently to the road behind the moving wagon. The impact jarred her legs, and she had to run a few steps to maintain her balance, but she managed to stay upright. For a few seconds, she was completely exposed, running along the open road behind the caravan while wearing a dress that clearly marked her as someone trying to avoid attention. Thinking quickly, she veered off the road and into the forest that bordered it on both sides. The trees provided immediate concealment, but she knew that her absence from the wagon would be discovered soon, and then the entire search would shift to the surrounding countryside. She needed to put as much distance as possible between herself and the caravan before that happened. The forest was thick and difficult to navigate, especially in the growing daylight that revealed how treacherous the terrain was. Fallen logs and dense underbrush slowed her progress, and branches caught at her dress and hair. She had never moved through wild terrain like this before, and she quickly discovered that her soft court shoes were completely in the dead of night. When shadows dance with secrets and whispers carry the weight of kingdoms, Princess Camila pressed her trembling hand against the cold stone wall of the castle corridor. Her heart thundered like war drums as she clutched a small leather bag containing everything she could sacrifice her royal life for freedom. Behind her lay a life of golden chains and predetermined destiny. Ahead waited the unknown darkness of a world where her crown meant nothing, where she could finally breathe without the suffocating weight of expectation. But in the space between her past and her future, between the life she was born into and the one she desperately craved, stood a single figure in polished armor whose loyalty to the crown ran deeper than blood. One man whose duty would either become her salvation or seal her fate forever. Some say that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face the impossible when everything you've ever known hangs in the balance. Tonight, Princess Camila would discover just how much she was willing to sacrifice for the chance to live as herself, not as the kingdom expected her to be.